Okay, some people are still asking me to send them to the Zoom link to their email, so. Arash is here. Yeah. As soon as Mr. Janice comes, we will start, hopefully. Mr. Gorgi, can I please ask to mute the audience's voice and video, please? Okay, Mr. Janice is trying to log in. He's joining us soon. So I wanted to request from everyone that just the panelists are with video, and I appreciate if they could turn their videos off, please. And Mr. Janice is joining us shortly, and then we will start. Hi, Mr. Janice.
Good morning.
Good
Sorry to be
morning.
late. I had a faulty Zoom code. I'm not sure. Maybe it was misentered on our end or something. But I was trying to sign in, and anyways, sorry to be late, and we got that.
That's okay.
Katarina resent it, so we're good now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I am going to start. I just wanted to, before I start, I just wanted to let everyone know that our expert, Kasra Arabi from UK, had his vaccination yesterday, and he is sick due to the side effects of the vaccination. He apologized. However, he will be joining us in our next event in a couple of weeks on the same subject of IRGC. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Akrami. I'm an Iranian-Canadian author and translator. My recent published book is called Still Revolution, the Ayatollah's Propaganda and Terrorism Machine. Today, I am very honored to moderate such an important event with the presence of the Honorable Garnet Janice, member of the Canadian Parliament, and sponsor of motion 754 for designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist entity, along with some of the young and talented Iranian experts and researchers who will share with us their knowledge of IRGC. I'm also very grateful to inform you that 3 family members of Flight PS 752 victims are also in this panel with us in order to share with us their fight to hold the Islamic Republic of Iran accountable for their heinous crime of downing the Ukrainian flight. This event is for 1 hour. Each speaker has 5 to 7 minutes. After that, we will have a Q&A session. The media can directly ask their questions from any particular speaker that they wish to. The audience can also type their questions here and specify that their question is for which speaker, and I will ask that. Without any further ado, we're going to hear from our first speaker, the Honorable Garnet Janice, who proposed motion 754 in 2018. The motion was supported by vast majority of liberals and all conservatives. Mr. Janice, please explain motion 754 to us, and why do you think that IRGC is detrimental to Canada's national safety and security, and at what point did you decide to propose such motion? Time is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's great to be on with all of you, and I want to, as always, salute the courage of the families who are impacted by the terrible shooting down of that flight, and salute your courage speaking out following that terrible event. So I put forward a motion in Parliament 3 years ago. At the time, I was the Deputy Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, working with Erin O'Toole, who's now our leader, of course, who at the time was our Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. And the motion had a number of different asks and issues within it with respect to the Iranian state and their actions. One of them was a call to immediately, and I'll emphasize the word immediately, list the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the criminal code. And I think this is something that's supported actually really all across the Iranian community. I know there are some different perspectives about the best way to handle the situation overall in terms of the regime and the challenges of standing up for human rights, while also people wanting to have access to the country and family members. But measures like this, which really target the perpetrators of violence, are I think overwhelmingly supported. within the community and beyond. And there were I think some reluctance, to be frank, in the Liberal Party about supporting this motion, but there were some political circumstances around the time that made them feel that they just needed to support it, and at the time the media kind of covered the Liberal support for our motion as a fairly dramatic about face. In the early years of their government, they were talking about trying to really warm things up with the regime, and the perception was that this decision to support our opposition motion was a success of parliamentary debate and democracy, because we were able to force a seeming change in direction. Unfortunately, it turned out that change in direction was more a change of signal than a change of substance, and it has now been 3 years since the motion passed to immediately list the IRGC, and we have not seen any steps to list it. And we've asked this question over and over again to the government, and there's a few things they'll say. They'll say, well, the Al-Quds force is already listed. Keep in mind that the Al-Quds force was actually listed previously by the previous Conservative government and was listed prior to the adoption of that motion. And yet they still voted for the motion, which was to list the IRGC in its entirety. Now they've said it's still under investigation. It's still being investigated. They won't actually be honest enough to come out and admit, which is almost certainly the case, which is that they have decided not to comply with that parliamentary motion for whatever reason. Just to put in context these timelines, I mean, it does take some time to go through the listing process, but it doesn't take 3 years. And earlier this year, there was following the terrible attack on Capitol Hill, there was some concern about quote unquote far right or alt right terrorist organizations, and a motion passed in Parliament calling on the government to list the Proud Boys as a terrorist entity. The government acted on that within a month. So within a month, they were able to go from a particular catalyst event to choosing to list an organization. Meanwhile, it's been almost 3 years with the IRGC. So I would submit to you that it is very clear that this is not a question of it just takes some time to do the investigation. This is a clear policy choice. A few other things about the context of that motion. One was that there were a substantial number of Liberal MPs, including, for instance, Majid Jahari from Richmond Hill, who did not attend the vote. So there were a lot of absences from the vote. I don't think it was a bout of the flu that was keeping everybody from showing up for the vote. So that suggested that, notwithstanding the fact that the Liberal caucus voted for it, there was division about even sending this signal, and now there's been no action. Of course, the downing of flight PS 752 was a year ago, and that underlines just the violence at the heart of the IRGC, the capricious disregard for human life that has so characterized this regime and this organization. My belief is that we need to be very clear in standing with the Iranian people, and in standing with peoples all over the world who are victims of violence and oppression. I think too often we get this kind of moral relativism from politicians who say, well, we do things our way, but this is just something about cultural differences, or we're not going to try to impose our values on other people. So let's be very clear about this. We're not trying to impose our values on anybody. We are standing in solidarity with everyday people in other parts of the world who have as much desire for freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law as people in Canada. Standing with those who are victims of violence and oppression is in no way imposing your values. It's rather protecting the right of everyday people to be heard, to have their values, desires, aspirations heard. And I know very clearly from the Iranian Canadian community, as well as what we've seen, the courageous protesters in Iran, that the people of Iran very much desire freedom, desire protection for human rights, and that just comes through so loud and so clearly, and we need to stand with them. One final point I wanted to make is that following some of the issues associated with foreign state-backed interference, I put forward a motion in Parliament, Motion 55, that is aimed at pushing the government to respond more effectively to foreign state-backed interference. I've heard, for instance, from some of the families affected by the downing of flight PS 752, that when they've tried to share their experiences and speak out about the cause of this violence, that they've actually faced intimidation and threats from the Iranian state. And this isn't an issue that is unique to the Iranian community. We have people from the Chinese community, people from the Saudi community, that are highlighting these issues of foreign states with authoritarianism in their DNA, trying to reach beyond their borders and actually threaten and intimidate and harm Canadians who are speaking out about human rights issues in these countries. And there's been a lot of frustration from people who have been victims of this kind of activity, that they try to raise these issues and they get the runaround. There's a lack of clarity about whether they're going to get support from Global Affairs, from local police, from the RCMP, from CSIS, what exactly the process is, and making sure that we have the resources to understand and respond to what is, I think, increasingly becoming the primary threat to our national security, which is the actions of foreign state-backed authoritarian states here in Canada, and the impact on Canadians, especially of Canadians from diasporic community backgrounds. So in addition to supporting the listing of the IRGC, I would appreciate your support for Motion 55 and for calls on the government to do more in general to respond to foreign state-backed interference and to support those who are victims of it. Thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this event today.
Thank you so much, the Honorable Gardner Janice. Our next speaker is Kaveh Shahruz. Kaveh Shahruz is a lawyer and human rights activist and a senior fellow with Macdonald Laurier Center for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad. He is also a former senior policy advisor on human rights to Global Affairs Canada, a graduate of Harvard Law School and the University of Toronto. He has written widely on human rights issues and international affairs. He led a recent successful effort to convince Canada's Parliament to recognize the 1988 massacre of political prisoners in Iran as constituting crimes against humanity under international law. He resides in Toronto. Kaveh, the question is, why should designation of the IRGC as a terrorist entity be a nonpartisan mandate for Canadian political parties? Time is yours, sir.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and good morning to everybody. And it's really nice to be on a panel with such terrific people. I know you indicated I have 5 to 7 minutes, but I think my answer is actually a relatively short one. So why is this a nonpartisan issue? Well, because the threat posed by the Revolutionary Guards is a nonpartisan issue. We have here today family members of Flight 752. When their loved ones boarded that flight, nobody was asked whether or not they're conservatives or liberals or NDP members. This was just an attack on human beings without regard to their politics. So our politicians shouldn't be thinking about addressing this crime in partisan terms. But you also look at other things that the IRGC does. It's really horrific involvement, for example, in the Syrian conflict, just outside the confines of Iran. The thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people dead in Syria as a result of IRGC action. That destabilizes the region. It harms Canadian interests. It's just immoral in and of itself, aside from all the other issues. And that's not a partisan issue. You think about some of the other nefarious actions of the IRGC. So it's campaign, and it's not just always the IRGC. The IRGC is obviously one of the most important arms of the Iranian regime, but it does it in concert with other elements of the Iranian regime. So the assassination campaign that it's carried out abroad. I mean, assassinations abroad have been a consistent Iranian policy, but taking extraterritorial action, kidnapping people abroad, and so on seems to have picked up again in recent years. And I see my colleague Cameron's on. He and I recently wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about this threat that's increasing with Iranian authorities, Iranian officials, oftentimes led by the IRGC, kidnapping people abroad and bringing them back to Iran and executing them in some cases. These are not partisan matters. You look at the arrest of dual citizens. I think, thankfully, I don't know of any Canadians in Iranian prison at the moment. I may be wrong on that. Unfortunately, these issues change a lot, but there are Iranian Americans in prison, British Americans, German Americans, German Iranians in Iranian prison. And the Iranian state and the IRGC don't really care about the partisan elements of this. These are attacks on Canada. These are attacks on the democratic world and the free world. And I think we ought to think about it as giving a collective and united response. The other elements of it, which I think actually connect directly to Canada, are a couple of things. One is, the IRGC is well known for being a deeply, deeply corrupt entity. Its theft is well documented. It's in the billions of dollars, and a lot of that money, I'm sorry to say, makes its way to Canada, and that really has a destabilizing effect on Canada, and it's also makes Canada just a safe haven for blood money. And I'm happy that Garnett and his colleagues have taken this issue seriously. I speak to lawmakers at least on one side of the partisan divide. They think about it, but this has a deeply destabilizing effect on Canada, and our policymakers, our lawmakers ought to be thinking about it in those terms. A few months ago, CSIS came out and said that there are a number of countries, they named Iran, they named Venezuela, they named China, as countries that have tried to actually interfere in our elections. And they named sort of nomination fights, for example, as the site where foreign governments try to interfere with our democratic process. This, again, is not a partisan issue. We ought to be taking this very seriously. And so I think the listing of the IRGC is just a way for our collective sort of for us as a united country, regardless of our differences on whatever policy matters, to actually respond to all these threats that I just listed in the last few minutes, and all this mayhem and all this illegality that's being carried out by the IRGC. This would be a collective response, regardless of partisan views. The other thing that I would say is the reason this is not a partisan issue is because listing the IRGC would bring us in line with our closest ally, which is the United States. I am not in the habit of praising the Trump administration, but among the things that Trump did right, I think, was listing the IRGC. And I think even now, when there is talk with the Biden administration of removing some of the sanctions, I believe that the IRGC sanction and its terrorist designation will remain in place. So I think the fact that we're kind of out of step with our closest ally is a problem. And the other thing that I would say is that this is a nonpartisan issue for the reason that Garnett mentioned, which is that it was actually, with the exception of certain members of parliament who magically got the flu that day, it was actually supported by members from all parties across the political spectrum. This was not viewed as a partisan issue, and members of the government and the cabinet actually supported Garnett's motion. Now, if you compare it to a couple of weeks ago when there was a motion before the House involving the genocide being carried out by China, you will note that the cabinet made a very clear point of not actually voting or abstaining from that vote. They didn't do so in this case with the vote on the IRGC listing. So it means that the support of the motion, the cabinet takes it seriously, right? So in the China case, they thought they didn't actually want to be on the record as supporting it. With the IRGC case, they actually did support it. So the support was widespread. It was across the political spectrum. And it's about time we take action. One final note I will add is that listing the IRGC from a legal perspective is difficult to do. It's not just a matter of writing it down in a piece of legislation. There are intricacies that have to be worked out. So the IRGC is a vast economic and military force, and its economic tentacles sort of reach all across Iran. So there are a lot of sort of innocent people that have no ties to the regime, but might be sort of economically caught up in this. Similarly, there are people who, as part of their military service, work for the IRGC who would not support it. And I think we ought to be very careful in how we design any terrorist designation, how we design any statute about this. But it's work that ought to be done. And if we put our mind to it, I think we can get it right. And we can get it right regardless of who's in power, whether it's conservatives or liberals or whoever. Anyway, all to say that I think this is, as far as I'm concerned, kind of a no-brainer. I'm really puzzled as to why the Trudeau government has not taken steps.
Thank you so much. Mr. Kaveh Shahruz, Senior Fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Our next speaker is Cameron Hansarinio. Cameron is a Policy Director of National Union for Democracy in Iran, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization of Iranian Americans supporting the movement for secular democracy and human rights in Iran. He heads research and writing advocacy efforts in the policy and policymaking communities, media relations, legislative efforts, and special projects for NUFI, and maintains contact with the Iranian American community and Iranian democracy activists across the political spectrum. Prior to joining NUFI, he worked at BlackRock after graduating from Harvard, where he studied government and was student body vice president. So Cameron, since the United States and Canada are neighboring countries, how does designation of the IRGC as a terrorist entity by Canada will maintain the national safety and security of both countries? Time is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you also, Your Honor, for your time today. I appreciate you allowing even us Americans to participate in today's conversation. As my friend and colleague Kaveh alluded to, this is not only not a partisan issue, but it should not be a national issue in the sense that it really should be a North American or a Western democratic nation issue, if you will. Before I get into that, I just want to make one brief comment on Mr. Janis's remarks and say how much I appreciate the reference you make to the discussion of values. I find it one that those on the so-called left, and as Sarah said, we are a nonpartisan organization. We look to work with people across all aisles. But the comment of values is very often made, and I actually think, and the notion that we can't enforce, quote unquote, our values on others, our American values, our Canadian values, our Western values, and I actually find it a very regressive thing to say, as a matter of fact, because the values of life and the values of liberty are really universal values. They do not belong only to Americans or only to Canadians. And so your comment, sir, about that was most appreciated. And I think something that we have to highlight more and more, that the Iranian people and the people of other oppressed nations have those very same rights. And so we certainly appreciate you standing up for those. To the question specifically, obviously, as Kaveh mentioned, our two countries, the United States and Canada, have a long and storied history. We are among the closest allies of each other. And for that reason, in addition to the obviously long contiguous border that we share, our national security interests are inextricably tied to one another. And so threats that are posed to Canada are naturally threats that are also posed to the United States and vice versa. And so the fact that the IRGC, as a result of not yet having been listed as a terrorist entity, has, to Kaveh's point, been able to make more inroads, be it financially or through their agents or other individuals who have made their way to Canada, it poses a significant national security threat for the United States, and one that I would argue can, down the road, if not properly addressed, cause problems between the critical alliance between our two countries. Now, the point of national security is quite obvious when it comes to the IRGC, whether it's the brutal murder of the 176 passengers above on a flight PS 752, and I offer my personal condolences to the families of those who are here, and it's really a personal it's an honor to stand next to you, but I'm sorry that I have to do so and that I have to call you the families of the victims of that flight, and I salute all the courage that each of you has shown. In addition to crimes like that and clear national security crimes, clear terrorist activities like the blowing up of a passenger airline, there are smaller and perhaps less clear threats that the IRGC poses, both to Canada and to the United States, and to the United States as a result of Canada's refusal yet to list it as a terrorist organization. The foreign influence operation of the Islamic Republic is particularly what I'm referring to, and the agents that it sends abroad, be they in the form of undercover operatives, secret operatives, if you will, sort of the things you'll see in the movies, collecting intelligence, collecting information, or those that they send in the cover of journalists, of academics who perhaps do have some journalistic duties, some academic duties, but their agenda is to promote the Islamic Republic's agenda. And until which time the IRGC is formally listed as a terrorist entity in Canada, I'm not an attorney, but I can simply say from a political perspective and from a logistical perspective, it's much more difficult to assess the impact of the IRGC's influence operation when it's not taken as a threat and it's not formally listed as a terrorist entity. But the activities that they are taking are without a doubt terroristic activities. They are posing significant threats to Canadian citizens, as you mentioned, sir. The people on this call, I know, be they the victims of Flight 752 or others, have been the subjects of serious threats, threats to their lives, threats of character assassination, physical assassination by the IRGC and elements which have found their way into Canada or used Canada as a base of operation. And that also poses a threat to those of us in the United States. I unfortunately have spoken to many friends and colleagues here in the United States who have similarly faced threats, threats on their lives, threats on the lives of their families by the IRGC. Again, Kaveh talked about the spree of executions that the Islamic Republic carried out in its early years. We had former prime ministers who were assassinated, former leading generals, members of our royal family, leading opposition activists of a variety of political stripes, all physically eliminated across Europe and also in the United States. We had here in Washington a former member of the embassy who was a political activist assassinated right here in Washington. And we're seeing those threats continue to grow. And as long as the IRGC is not designated as a terrorist entity, that threat will continue, and in my view, it will expand until we properly put a microscope on this problem. Canadians and as a result, Americans will unfortunately continue to be at risk. So, sir, I most appreciate your leadership on this issue, and I hope that you'll be able to pass on some of this information to your colleagues, especially those who, as yet, regrettably, have been unwilling to support this. And Sarah, thank you for your time and for organizing this.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cameron Hansarinio, Policy Director of the National Union for Democracy in Iran. Now we're going to move on to the subject of Flight PS 752. Our next speaker is Mr. Javad Soleimani, who lost his wife Elnaz Nabi on Flight PS 752. He is also the chair of fact-finding committee for Association of Families of Flight PS 752 victims. Mr. Soleimani, it's been more than a year since downing of Flight PS 752 by IRGC missiles. What are some of the activities of Association of Families of Flight PS 752 victims for holding the Islamic Republic of Iran accountable? Time is yours, sir.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this panel. Thank you, Sergeant, for this panel. Regarding your question, yeah, we have some specific demands from the Canadian government. One of them is actually recognizing the IRGC as a terrorist entity and implementing Magnitsky Act, and also We have been in touch in full cooperation with the Canadian government in different levels. But honestly, after 15 months, we can say that the Canadian government strategy was kind of passive. We hope after actually releasing the forensic team report, Canadian forensic team report, the Canadian government step up for actually taking the regime to International Court of Justice or opening a criminal case in Canada. I lost my wife, Elnaz, downing of flight PS752, and I'm here on behalf of the Association of Families of Flight PS752 Victim, which is a Canadian established legal entity and represent more than 145 victims of Flight PS752. Just in the beginning, I like to emphasize that the Iranian regime and IRGC are not separable. When we talk about the terrorist nature of the IRGC, in fact, we are talking about the terrorist nature of the regime. We cannot recognize a branch of IRGC like international branch of IRGC Sports as a terrorist group, but recognize the whole IRGC as a normal military force. There are tons of reasons for designating IRGC as a terrorist entity under the Criminal Code of Canada. Here, I'll just mention 10 of them. First, Iranian regime and IRGC have been involved in different terrorist attacks and bombing plots over the past 43 years. For instance, IRGC was found liable in 2018 for the 1996 Hobart Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia, which killed 19 Americans. Another example, IRGC planned a bomb attack in Kenya and plotted an attack in Turkey, and IRGC forces were arrested in 2012. 2. The Iranian regime continued supporting terrorist plots to attack Iranian dissidents in several countries in Europe. In recent years, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Albania have all either arrested or expelled Iranian government officials implicated in various terrorist plots in their respective territories. 3. The IRGC operates and controls a major portion of Iran's economy through both licit and illicit means. The IRGC has been involved in drug dealing, human trafficking, and smuggling different goods. Now, businesses and banks around the world now have a clear duty to ensure that companies with which they conduct financial transactions are not connected to the IRGC in any material way. The IRGC and the Iranian regime have been in collaboration with Taliban and Al-Qaeda in different cases. And 5, the Iranian regime former and current leader several times emphasized that they intend to wipe out Israel. They write down on their missiles that Israel must be destroyed. 6, Mahan Airline, as one of the biggest Iranian airlines, is fully under the control of IRGC. The IRGC uses civilian airliners as a cover to transfer weapons and military forces to different countries like Syria and Lebanon. 7, over the past 43 years, the Iranian regime and IRGC have suppressed protesters. We won't forget bloody November, where thousands of protesters were murdered by the Iranian regime. We won't forget the Havaran mass murder in 1988. As you know, probably IRGC has some secret prisons, torturing and murdering innocent people and dissidents. We won't forget the 2009 movement when some protesters were killed in a Kahrizak, a secret prison. 8, the Iranian regime maintains a robust offensive cyber program and has sponsored cyber attacks against foreign governments and private sector entities. 9, Iranian officials like Mohsen Rezai, the former IRGC commander, clearly announced that by a hostage taking of Americans or other nationalities and requesting money, they could resolve the regime's financial difficulties. As you know, on January 8, 2020, the regime, amid significant military tension between Iran and US, knowingly kept the airspace open led to the downing of flight PS752 with IRGC missiles. The Canadian former Foreign Minister Champagne clearly said that he doesn't believe human error narrative, and human error story is just kind of oversimplification of what really happened on that night. Moreover, as the United Nations rapporteur on arbitrary execution on February 22nd explained, numerous unanswered questions are surrounding the downing of flight PS752, and as long as the Iranian regime does not answer these questions, the intentionality scenario is very serious. Recently, the head of the Ukrainian Security Council clearly said that the Iranian regime intentionally shut down the flight PS752. The regime and IRGC won't answer numerous questions surrounding the downing of flight PS752. This is really my question. What should we call a regime firing missiles on a civilian airliner over an international airport? A normal regime or a terrorist regime? Definitely the Iranian regime is not a normal regime. And it's very, I think, more dangerous than any terrorist group. It's an organized terrorist group with money, media, and some lobbyists and apologists in the West. It's actually a terrorist regime, not a normal government. I do believe that for the safety of Canadian residents and all civilians around the world, it's time for the Canadian government and international community to implement targeted, impactful actions against IRGC and the regime. And there are different benefits, but I think two principal benefits of the designation of IRGC as a terrorist organization are, first of all, the messaging, which illustrates in a very dramatic way that the regime is unique among the governments of the world in its use of terrorism as a basic tool of statecraft. And secondly, this gives us new tools for prosecutors to hold accountable people who provide support to the IRGC. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Javad Soleimani, who lost his wife Elnaz Nabi on flight PS752.
Sorry, John, just one thing to add. This is really my question. What else they should have done to convince politicians that they are nothing except a terrorist entity? This is really my question.
I am definitely going to mention that during the Q&A session. We're getting there soon, sir. Thank you so much for your time. Our next speaker is Mr. Ali Gorji, who lost his niece, newlywed niece, Pune Gorji, along with her husband, Arash Purzarabi, on flight PS752. Mr. Gorji, when you heard the news of flight PS752, what went through your mind, and did you believe that it was a human error? Time is yours, sir. Mr. Gorji.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everybody. Yes, I lost my niece and husband in this city. They were young, brilliant students studying their masters in artificial intelligence in the University of Alberta. And they went back home to celebrate their marriage and with family and friends coming back to Canada, they lost their lives. And as my friend Javad said, obviously the regime of Iran and the Irgc, they are not inseparable. They actually, Irgc, the regime of Iran is under control of Irgc, and the Irgc is like an embodiment of the regime's ideology and the politics. And from the beginning, we knew, because we know the regime of Iran and we know the nature of violent nature and criminal nature, and we knew that that was intentional. Shutting down of the airplane was intentional amid the conflict with the United States and the attacking the bases in Iraq and avoiding the attacking back from the United States. They did this crime. And when soon we fired, some of families fired what we could do at that time was to file a lawsuit against the regime of Iran and authorities of IRGC as a terrorist act based on amendment to the State Immune Act of Canada that allows the victims of families to sue the regime of Iran and actually Syria, two states in the world. So we launched a lawsuit in the Ontario Superior Court. But what's interesting, we, as an experience, because that type of the lawsuit should be served through the Foreign and Global Affairs of Canada to the regime of Iran, but it's a matter of normally 1-2 weeks, but it takes 8 months before, and then with our pressure and through the justice system, the government of Canada served this lawsuit to the regime of Iran, and now it's ongoing a matter in the court. But what we understood that how, at what extent the government of Canada is not helpful, and there are not any willingness to help the families, the victim's family, and to pursue the justice. That's our personal experience. Even the meeting we had with Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, from the beginning and consistently, they believed that that was a mistake. And I don't know how they conclude this before any investigation. So the point is that the government of Canada and Liberal Party actually, its reluctance and unwillingness, and I can say its resistance to enforce the motion, which is being already 3 years ago, passed in the both houses, it's not normal. It's not a bureaucratic issue, complexity. It's not. It's much more than. And the other side, we see that Canada is a destination, a huge amount of money laundering from the regime and the Irgc. Okay, we have information about that. And all this raises this question, serious question. Are some of Canadian politicians are under the influence of this dirty money which comes from Iran? That's what we are working. We have an organization, we are working on that, and we will find that, and we go after them, because we believe that the ultimate justice about all crimes of the regime and IRC they did in Iran is to overthrow the regime and execute justice against them. And it's, as a Canadian Iranian, we never allow the Liberal Party to support the regime, and we will do that for sure, that we will fight to pass this, to enforce this listing of IRGC listing as a terrorist, and to fight against the regime influence in Canada. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ali Gorji, who lost his newlywed niece Pune Gorji and her husband Arash Purzarabi on flight PS 752. Our final speaker is Arash Murattab, who lost his brother Arvin Murattab and his wife Aida Farzaneh. He is also vice president of Association of Families of Flight PS 752 victims. Arash, please tell us, when was the last time that you spoke to your brother, and what are your expectations from Canadian politicians regarding IRGC? Time is yours, sir.
IRGC murdered my brother and my sister-in-law Aida on January 8th, 2020. Last time I spoke with Arvin was a few minutes before his flight takes off from IKA airport. I was reading the news. I was really worried about what's gonna happen with the situation, and I was asking for his flight number. I was checking the news, I was checking the flight radar website to see where's his flight going. And unfortunately for me, everything was so surreal and I was seeing everything real time. And I still can't believe it. I will never forget that that 5 days before the IRGC shutdown of flight PS752, Qasem Soleimani, the head of IRGC Quds Force, was killed in an operation. He was the head of a terrorist entity under Canada's criminal code. 5 days later, IRGC started the operation known as Hard Revenge and launched missiles at US bases in response. As the IRGC commander stated, the country was on the highest alert situation while they were keeping the airspace open for international commercial flights, and SAM units were placed near the airports. They planned and started the operation. No US citizens died and they didn't close the airspace. They shot a civilian plane twice, 176 plus 1 human beings murdered, and they lied and fabricated conspiracies for 3 days with their propaganda machine. It was naive that some thought designating IRGC as a terrorist entity right away would work against the interests of the victims' families by hindering cooperation with the Iranian government. Which cooperation they were talking about? Now 471 days have passed and Iran's final report is out. The world saw that this brutal regime murders and mocks international laws. Did you know this report does not even mention the word IRGC, the main actor who accepted the responsibility for PS752 missile shots? Last week, Security Chief Officer told Globe and Mail PS752 shutdown was intentional and a conscious attack. Now the world is waiting for Canada's response to all these human rights violations by IRGC and the regime. In January 2018, even before the PS752 atrocity, the House of Commons passed a motion to list IRGC as a terrorist entity. But this has not yet been implemented by the government. We don't know why. Terrorist acts are broadly defined in Canadian law. Just for the case of PS752 specifically, they include criminal negligence at the direction of a terrorist group and activity that, quote, causes damage to an aircraft in service that renders the aircraft incapable of flight or that is likely to endanger the safety of the aircraft in flight. The shooting down of flight PS752 could very well fit these descriptions. It is important to know that Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is a parallel force to the army, created after the mullahs seized power in 1979. This army is not made to protect the citizens. It is ideological to the extent that based on the regime's founder, Ruhollah Khomeini, it can use human shields and can justify sacrificing the life of its own innocent citizens. He said in 1981, in quotes, if the infidels shielded a group of Muslims, let's say the corrupt Iraq shielded a group of innocent Muslims and stood behind them, we must kill Muslims and non-Muslims. Muslims are martyrs and they go to heaven. Kafirs are infidels and they go to hell. It has been proven that IRGC has helped the regime tremendously to suppress the people, killed thousands of peaceful protesters violently, and kidnapped and assassinated the oppositions inside and outside Iran. This group is becoming a model for all other extremist groups in the world. It's like an ISIS arm being in power for 42 years. They've built proxy groups, underground missile arsenals, suicide drones, economic mafia, media networks, and collaborating openly with Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Houthis, and training many more. We believe IRGC is much more dangerous than any of the groups listed under criminal code to Canada and global safety. Canada should stand firm to protect its people. We believe planners and operators of killing the innocent Canadians should be punished and listed as terrorist entities under the criminal code. We should not tolerate these extreme groups. We should not allow them to advertise, recruit, fund, and have sympathizers in this country. The regime in Iran considers inaction as weakness, and history shows pressure works dealing with this regime. Remember, Zahra Kazemi was sexually assaulted and murdered when Canada had full diplomatic relations with Iran. Are we going to repeat the same mistake?
Thank you. Arash, would you like to continue or?
I'm done.
Thank you so much, Arash Muratab, who lost his brother, Arvin Muratab, and his wife, Aida Farzana, on flight PS-752. Regarding flight PS-752, I know that there were 3 passengers on the flight from UK. Our speaker from UK, Kasra Arabi, will appear in our next event, who also appeared before the UK Foreign Affairs Committee to give evidence on IRGC. He was unable to attend today due to side effects of the vaccination that he had yesterday. He apologized, but he will be joining us in our next event. So since we are getting to final minutes of our event, we're going to get to the Q&A session. There is one question that I wanted to ask from the Honorable Garnet Janice, and then we will ask a question from Kaveh Shahruz. The question from the Honorable Garnet Janice is that why do you think there is a delay in adding IRGC into terrorist list? We heard excuses from Mr. Goodell regarding paperwork and procedures, but what do you think
Okay.
Thank you for that question, and I want to be very clear that I see the alleged delay not as a matter of delay, but as a matter of excuse stemming from a decision by the government not to list the IRGC. I can't prove that, but it's been 3 years, and the Proud Boys were listed within a month. And Mr. Shahruz is quite right to point out some of the complexities and intricacies involved. I'm not saying that it should have occurred within a month in this case, but there are a variety of complex cases in which terrorist organizations which haven't even existed for 3 years have been listed. So, you know, the dog ate my homework. There's a lot of forms to fill out. Is just not a plausible excuse under the circumstances. The only plausible explanation here is that the government has decided that they don't want to list the IRGC, and also that they've decided that they don't want to openly, honestly communicate that fact. So I don't think if this government stays in power for another 20 years, I suspect we'll still be waiting for them to figure out how to fill out the paperwork. So when it comes to looking at the choices politically, I think that's something that people should just acknowledge as being the reality.
Thank you so much. I wanted to know if there is anyone in our audience would like to ask Mr. Kaveh Shahruz a question. If not, I will ask him a question because our time is ending soon. Okay, so I will ask that from Mr. Kaveh Shahruz. Kaveh, the question is that if the IRGC was recognized as a terrorist entity in 2013, let's just say the entire organization, what would have been changed right now? Like, do you think the families of flight PS-752 would have had less obstacles in holding the Islamic Republic of Iran accountable?
That's a really good question. So I think there would have been several things that would flow from an earlier designation. So first of all, you know, any mayhem that the IRGC has been able to carry out in Canada up until now, I think there's a good argument to be made that, you know, we would have taken those threats much more seriously, and we might have been able to stop them. And some of those threats we actually, to be honest with you, we don't know about right now because, you know, these are clandestine operations that the IRGC carries out in countries around the world. With respect to PS-752, unfortunately, I don't think it would have prevented the tragedy itself. I shouldn't even just merely call it a tragedy. I mean, it was a crime. But I think it might have made it easier for certain legal theories to be put forth in Canadian court. So I know that there's a legal action currently underway on the basis that this was actually a terrorist action. And the reason why the claim is structured that way is because, you know, countries, governments tend to be protected by a doctrine of what's called state immunity. And there are some ways to pierce through that doctrine. One of them is we've got legislation that says if a government is involved in terrorist actions, then it doesn't get the benefit of state immunity. And right now, there are lawyers before the courts arguing that what happened with PS 752 was a terrorist act, and that's the reason why this lawsuit should be able to go forward. I think that's an uphill argument at the moment, but I think it would be a lot easier to make that claim if the entity that you're dealing with that actually ordered the shooting down of this flight was already recognized by the Canadian government and was already listed as a terrorist organization. So I think that would certainly have gone a long way in bringing some justice and some compensation to the families.
Thank you so much, Kaveh. Thanks for your presence here. Now we're going to move on to our Q&A session. I wanted to ask if the media wants to ask any questions from any of our other speakers. They can do so. Other than that, we can go to our audience and they can ask their questions. But Kaveh, thank you so much for your presence.
Thank you very much. And I have to apologize to other members. I do have to run, but this was a wonderful panel, and I hope that there are more of these. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, so do we have any questions from the audience? Okay. The question from Mr. Janice is, what can we do as citizens to hold this government accountable with regards to IRGC? And do you think the upcoming election can be a way to facilitate that? Mr. Janice?
I'm sorry, I just missed the first part of it. Can you just quickly repeat the question? Sorry about that.
Sure. The question is, what can we do as citizens to hold this government accountable with regards to IRGC? And do you think the upcoming election can be a way to facilitate that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, so thank you. It's a great question. Everyday citizens can and should speak out about these issues and work to raise awareness about them within your wider communities. Ensuring your non-Iranian friends understand and appreciate the issues that are involved as well, broadening that awareness and support. Of course, we need to hold politicians accountable for what they do and what they don't do. And sometimes we have politicians that are great at talking a good game, but that don't follow through. And we've talked about that in terms of the government enlisting the IRGC, wanting to send a certain signal, but not wanting to actually deliver the goods. So when it comes down to the next election, I'm hopeful that these issues of national security, of human rights, are key parts of the conversation that takes place, and politicians are held accountable for what they do and what they don't do. When the government has had as long as they have to take action on this, we can reasonably come to the conclusion that they don't intend to take action on it. So holding people accountable for their words and their actions in terms of how you vote, who you support, how you get involved, I think is the right thing to do, and it's how we actually get results in a democratic society.
Thank you so much. We have another question. Iranian community is worried about news of IRGC spying networks. One instance of it is the case of Mr. Espahbud publicized a few months ago, and there is a link to that on Guardian. Can the Iranian community in Canada be rest assured that RCMP and Canadian government are taking IRGC threats seriously? There are more grounds to take IRGC men seriously. That's for the Honorable Garnet Janice, the question.
Yes, thank you for that. So, I mean, I don't want to comment directly. I don't know that I have enough information to comment directly on what specific institutions within the government, like the RCMP, in terms of how they take these threats, because ultimately our institutions, our public servants are accountable to the elected government. And so they may identify and flag threats, and then it's up to the government to decide how to act or deliver on those threats. So I do think there's a role for continuing dialogue with the RCMP, with CSIS, with our various security agencies, but they are charged in our system with fearless advice and then faithful implementation. Do I think the government takes these threats seriously? No, I don't. I think the government really has failed to put in place policies to combat foreign state-backed interference, as I talked about. And I think there's there's been a failure to look at other policy issues. So one of the speakers spoke about money laundering and the impact that has here in Canada. We have in the past that in the opposition proposed measures to respond to that money laundering, and various institutions, including real estate associations, have put forward some ideas on how to do that. But we haven't seen the action required in response to that. So the government certainly needs to do much more, I think.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have a couple more questions. There's one for, again, the Honorable Garnet Janice, another one for Kamran. Okay, the question is, does Canadian government have oversight on aviation safety organization in Canada, Montreal, organizations such as ICAO, IATA, etc.? That's the question.
You know, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that offhand. I can like maybe we can figure out a way to connect the person asking the question with our Shadow Minister for Transport, Stephanie Kuzi, who can probably offer a more detailed answer than that. But in terms of those specific elements of governance, I'm sorry, transport isn't something that I have as much of a line of sight on. So apologies, but I'll try to follow up.
Thank you. There's a question from Cameron, for Cameron. It was already sent to me, and the question is that since the previous US administration designated the entire IRGC organization as a terrorist entity, have the activities of people who are sympathizers of IRGC in US been eliminated? How did it help the pro-democracy activists in the US?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the person who asked the question. I think part of this is similar to what Kaveh said in response to the question regarding whether the Canadian listing of the IRGC as a terrorist organization would have prevented the massacre of those aboard PS752, and I agree with him that is not necessarily the case. The benefits that come from something like this, and I think that the benefits that we've seen in the United States, part of it simply comes from what we would, I guess, refer to as naming and shaming. When you have the bully pulpit of a leading democracy, for example, the United States, or in this case, Canada, formally listing an entity like the IRGC as a terrorist organization, it simply raises the global level of consciousness about this terrorist entity. And as Mr. Soleimani and Gorgi said, the terrorist nature of the entirety of the Islamic Republic, not just the IRGC. So I think that to the specific question, the temperature was certainly raised on people in the United States who are sympathizers of and or potentially affiliates of the IRGC, because now there's even more of a microscope on them if they do have any such connections to the IRGC. And those obviously all have to be pursued legally, and we can't cast aspersions. But for the people who, if they do have connections, I'm sure that they were certainly much more concerned about their illicit activities. And you have seen, they're not necessarily connected, but you have seen the US government, especially under the previous administration, take the actions of the influence network of the Islamic Republic much more seriously. We saw Kaveh Shahruz, who is a reported agent of the Islamic Republic for a violation of FARA. He was taken into custody and he's currently awaiting trial. Just this past week, the Republican Study Committee in the House introduced something called the Maximum Pressure Act. And we had the pleasure of working with some of the staffers and the members of that coalition. And one of the parts of the legislation that they included, although not directly related to IRGC, is related to this whole campaign to identify the Islamic Republic's influence operation, was the proposal of a report by the State Department's Global Engagement Center into the Islamic Republic's propaganda and disinformation campaigns abroad, specifically in the United States. So these are all interrelated, although not necessarily directly correlated in this particular instance.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions. It's again from the Honorable Gardner Janet. He's very popular among the Persian youth. The question is, there were three passengers from UK who were on flight PS 752, and the question is that it was sent to me. Why do you think that the Commonwealth countries should unanimously include IRGC in their list of terrorist organizations unanimously?
No, that's a great question, and the particulars of anti-terrorism law vary slightly, but there's a lot of commonalities in terms of structure across different like-minded countries, and very often we see efforts by hostile regimes. I think we see this particularly with China, but we see it with the government of Iran as well, to try to kind of divide and pick off individual countries to kind of play nicer with one while isolating another, to try to forestall the creation of a kind of more united effort. So I think all countries should work together to list the IRGC as a terrorist entity, but we should look for broader cooperation to whatever extent is possible. But there's a caveat to that, I guess, too, in that multilateral cooperation shouldn't mean us waiting for other countries to take action. Sometimes people invoke the importance of working together as a basis for saying, well, let's not do anything ourselves until others have taken action. No, we should be willing to lead, and we should be trying to work multilaterally by taking stands that reflect our values and by inviting other countries and encouraging them to do the same.
And the other question is that if the Tories form a government, what are the steps you take to ensure that IRGC will be listed as a terrorist entity?
Well, we'll get it done. I mean, it's quite simple. Like it's a clear intention and commitment on our part that when we take office, we will actually deliver the goods. People are, I think, sick of hearing the words but not the action, and I look forward to a time when we have the ability to take the action that's required.
There is one final question asking that how will Canada assure the family members of Flight PS 752 who are in Canada and are being intimidated by members of, like people who are sympathizers of the Islamic Republic of Iran, to be protected? How can they be rest assured that they're not being intimidated or harassed or being threatened?
Yes, thank you. So Motion 55 that I've talked about is not legislation. It is the kind of thing you can do from opposition, which is a motion to government calling on them to take specific action in a number of spheres. One of those is to have a coordinated plan for responding to foreign state-backed interference. Another is dramatically and directly improving support to victims. And a third is working with provinces and territories and municipal governments on issues of interference and intimidation that require a response at other levels. So, in a federal country where obviously a substantial amount of policing happens at other levels, we need to have that cross-jurisdictional coordination. Many good ideas have been put forward in terms of the specifics of what a plan like that would look like. Not as relevant in the Iranian case, but we need to be clear about expelling diplomats who are involved in intimidation, interference with Canadians. We need to have a kind of single point of contact for victims, so that if you're experiencing that foreign intimidation, you know where to call, and there's coordination across global affairs, CSIS, RCMP, local police. We need to make sure that we can access the capacity for investigations. Things like translation of threatening messages it seems like a simple thing, but these kind of logistics are sometimes where we fall down in actually getting things done. I mentioned the question of money coming into the country. Money is a big factor in terms of supporting those who were involved in these kinds of intimidation activities, and also co-opting certain institutions. So having better enforcement on money laundering is critically important. You know, there's issues around technology and spying. And you know, again, we've taken a clear position on Huawei, and I think with the increasing cooperation between the Chinese state and the Iranian state, with the agreement just announced, especially the digital security of people in the Iranian community will be critically important as well. So all of these are sort of different elements of what we need to be thinking about in terms of a plan. We have repeatedly called for that cohesive plan. The particulars of that plan, to some extent, have to be worked out in government, because they'll reflect the intelligence that's available. They'll reflect the kind of capacity and mechanics the government uniquely has for putting this plan in place. We haven't had a plan up till now. We need to put in place and implement that plan, and that will be a critical priority for us if we have the honor of taking government soon.
There are two more questions, and then we will be done. One of them is a little bit long statement, but it's a really good question. It's from the Honorable Garnet Janice. We have reported evidence that border officers who check the passengers' passports ask several passengers if they have American citizenship. Combining this fact with the international and planned downing of flight PS-752, I believe we can come to the agreement that although IRGC implemented propaganda of hard revenge against the US, still they were afraid of the consequences of killing the US citizen, while clearly they had no concern on challenges that might arise to deal with Canadian government. Would it be different if the Canadian government had taken serious and meaningful action in response to all other IRGC's terrorism acts in the last few years?
Well, it is challenging to say, you know, yes, it would have been different. No, it wouldn't have been different. These are questions that do invite a little bit of speculation about what's in the mind of the regime. But I think at a general level, we can say this. The Iranian regime responds to power. It responds to meaningful and credible responses. It doesn't respond to sort of asking to be nice. I have a favorite fable, which is the story of the frog and the scorpion. For those who haven't heard it, the story is of a frog and a scorpion that are standing beside the edge of a river, and the scorpion asks the frog to carry him across on his back, and the frog says, "Well, how do I know you won't sting me?" And the scorpion says to the frog, "Well, if I sting you, then we'll both drown." And the frog says, "Okay," and starts to take him across the river. Partway along, the scorpion stings the frog, and as they're both sinking, he asks why, and the scorpion says, "It's in my nature." This fable underlines the fact that especially with hostile actors, but I think people in general, they behave more in accordance with their nature than with how you treat them, or what you think would be in their interest. The government of Canada should not be naive about the nature of the Iranian regime. If we are generous to that regime, if we give concessions to that regime as a way of trying to show goodwill, then we are simply the frog in the fable of the frog and the scorpion. We are expecting them to reciprocate our treatment, when in reality that regime will still behave in accordance with their nature, which is why we need to be focused and serious and establish those clear, hard lines that we know the regime does respond to when they're laid down.
Thank you so much. Final question from Mr. Gorgi. Based on your observation, how can Canadian public, including those living in Quebec, be engaged with this issue, lack of accountability on flight PS-752, and understand the dangers faced by this entity? Mr. Gorgi?
Actually, part of pursuing the justice is the Association of the Victims' Family in charge, so they can follow their activities and help them to pursuing the justice and so on. But what is concerning the IRGC listing, our organization, Iran Moving, we founded the organization, and one of our objectives is listing IRGC as a terrorist entity. And we are launching a campaign, petition, and we have a lot of activities coming out soon that they can help us because that's the objective is to finally the government of Canada list the IRGC as a terrorist entity. So they can help us in our activities, especially in Quebec. They can contact us, our organization.
Thank you so much. This is, I promise, it's a final question to Mr. Javad Soleimani. Could you please provide update on what is Canadian government doing in response to international downing of flight PS-752, especially after Ukrainian officials clearly stated the international act?
Okay, it's a really tough question. Okay, 138 of those innocent victims had strong ties to Canada. But honestly, now many families of victims are really frustrated. The Canadian government always postponed everything at first to Iran's final report. And then after that, they are saying that everything's after the Canadian forensic team report on the downing of flight PS-752. Over the past months, it seems that the Canadian government is very active behind the scene. But I think we can judge the Canadian government after the Canadian forensic team final report on the downing of flight PS-752 and the Canadian government actions after this report. I think maybe this is the last opportunity for the Canadian government to be on the right side of the history. And regarding also, I just want to mention something about the intentionality. Regarding the intentionality, it wasn't the first time that top officials, Canadian or Ukrainian officials, talk about intentionality. I can see here some military and aviation experts. They can talk about Iran's final report that they actually didn't conduct an impartial and credible investigation. There are numerous unanswered questions surrounding the downing of flight PS-752. And the UN rapporteur on arbitrary execution clearly said that the onus is on Iran to prove that it wasn't intentional. And now we are here, and the Iranian regime actually murdered our loved ones intentionally and deliberately. But unfortunately, the Canadian government didn't take impactful action against the regime. Our demand is very clear. It's very clear and simple. Take the regime to International Court of Justice or open a criminal case in Canada. There are numerous reasons that you can open a criminal case in Canada. I hope we're gonna hear some good news after the Canadian forensic team final report.
Thank you so much. Let's just say a few words to the Honorable Garnet Janice, because we're not going to take too much of his time. The Honorable Garnet Janice, thank you so much for all your efforts. We will have more of these events until the federal election to raise more awareness about IRGC within the Canadian and Persian community. We appreciate all your help, and thank you so much for being here today. On behalf of everyone and all speakers. And after that, I will be talking to the audience in Persian. The same thing that I told you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gantz.
Thank you. Okay, دوستان خیلی ممنونم از همه شما عزیزان که تشریف آوردید. یک سری سوالایی که برای من ارسال کردید، اینها یک سری سوالایی هستش که ما میتونیم در برنامه‌های بعدی با مهمان‌های دیگه‌ای که داشته باشیم مطرح کنیم. یک سری سوالایی هستش در زمینه foreign interference، نفوذ خارجی، یعنی همون عوامل جمهوری اسلامی در آمریکا و کانادا که داریم روی این قضیه کار میکنیم. حتما از طریق عزیزان، انجمن خانواده ها و ایران نوین و تمام فعالان دیگه روی این برنامه کار میکنیم و اطلاعات بیشتر رو در اختیارتون قرار میدیم تا در برنامه‌های دیگه این سوالاتتون مطرح بشه. این فعلا جلسه اول بود، امیدوارم که خوبی بدی دیدید ما رو ببخشید اگه ممنونم، ولی همتون تشریف آوردید دیگه. به قول معروف I did my best.
سارا جان مرسی واقعا زحمت
نباشید
کشیدی.
سارا جان.
آره مرسی.
ممنون سارا جان، خیلی عالی بود. مثل همیشه زحمت کشیدی و امیدواریم همینجور ادامه پیدا کنه این جلسات.
خیلی ممنون. مرسی.
خیلی ممنونم. ممنون هستم از
همین دوستان دیگه.
خیلی ممنون از آقای کامران خانسارینیا، دکتر گنجی از واشنگتن، همه شما عزیزان، آقای نبوی از واشنگتن، دوستان عزیزی که از ونکوور اومدن. فکر کنم خواهر نیلوفر ابراهیم هم تشریف داشتن، نواز ابراهیم هم از انگلستان تشریف داشتن. امیدوارم در برنامه بعدی هم ببینیم، چون که کسرا عربی هم از لندن به ما خواهند پیوست. آقای فرزین ندیمی هم خیلی ممنون، باعث افتخار بود. بله نواز از آمریکا هستش، ببخشید خواهرشون از انگلستان بودن. حتما با اکسپرت های ایرانی دیگه در تماس خواهیم بود. ازتون خواهش میکنیم از اکسپرت های دیگه اگر دوست داشته باشید با ما همکاری کنید حتما با ما تماس بگیرید. من ایمیل آدرسم sara@gmail.com هستش، یا میتونید با عزیزان انجمن خانواده های قربانیان هواپیمای اوکراینی و یا آقای گرجی تماس بگیرید. در همچنین تشکر میکنم از همه دوستان عزیزی که کمک کردن پشت صحنه، خودشون میدونن. خیلی ممنونم.
من بگم دفعات بعد سعی میکنیم یه جور نشه صبح زود ونکوور دوستان باشه که مجبور باشن هفت صبح باشن برای
خوبه براشون جناب گرجی، کمی سحر
اشکالی نداره.
بله مرسی. خانم شهناز مرتب هم از آلمان تشریف بردن. خیلی ممنون از همگی. روزتون، عصرتون هر جا که هستید خوش باشه تا برنامه دیگه. مرسی کامران جان. خدا خواهش میکنم. خدا